The core of that book, of this book, is that the problem in American society has been orchestrated by corporate forces, by a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, as John Ralston Saul points out, which has transformed American society into a version of the late Roman Republic, the facade of democratic process, electoral politics, civil liberties, a court system that defends the rights of citizens remains. But internally, corporations have seized all of the levers of power. And there's a great, probably our greatest political philosopher, Sheldon Wolin, and I interviewed him on YouTube. You can watch it for 3 hours a year before he died. Taught at Berkeley, later at Princeton, who writes in his classic work, Democracy Incorporated, that there are no institutions left within American society that can authentically be called democratic. That we live in what he describes as a system of inverted totalitarianism. And by that, he means it's not classical totalitarianism. We still have the iconography and language of the republic, of a democratic system. But the primacy of economics, the ideology of neoliberalism, which calls on us to kneel before the dictates of the marketplace, to structure our society around the primacy of profit, has essentially turned those institutions and the democratic system into a facade. Anytime a cabal seizes power, whether it's monarchical, communist, fascist, or corporate, and it redirects the institutions that once made incremental and piecemeal reform possible towards accumulating a greater concentration of wealth among the elite and amassing ever greater systems of power. It fosters, in essence, political paralysis. The system works only for a tiny segment of the ruling oligarchic class and becomes increasingly oppressive to the majority of citizens. I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which is a study of liberal institutions and what has happened to them within American society. And in the corruption and destruction of the liberal class, which in a capitalist democracy should function as a kind of safety valve to ameliorate the stresses and suffering within the society. We saw an example of this with the breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s and the response by the ruling oligarchic class under Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, in his private correspondence, in the letters published after his death to his brother, writes that if we in the oligarchic elite do not respond, we will get revolution. Those are Roosevelt's words. So we must If the private sector cannot create jobs, then we as government must create jobs. And Roosevelt creates 12 million jobs. Social Security. Many of the unionists who rose up in the 1930s had not been members of a union previously, especially after the assault against unions following World War I. That's how a functioning liberal class works. The liberal class was never designed to be the political left. It responded to populist movements, the Progressive Party, the CIO, the Communist Party, who we have erased from our history. But corporate forces, frightened by the uprisings in the 1960s, what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called the excess of democracy, followed the 1971 Lewis Powell memo, the blueprint by which they used corporate power, corporate influence, and corporate money to corrupt and finally destroy those institutions within a society, including academia, that are tasked with providing a critique of the society and making sure that civil and political discourse remains rooted in verifiable fact. And the poster child for the faux liberal class is Bill Clinton, who passes NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the American working class since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, who signs into law the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which explodes the system of mass incarceration from roughly 700,000 to over 2 million by the end of his presidency. And it wasn't just that he expanded the prison population. He and Joe Biden and the other Democratic leaders, intent on seizing back the quote-unquote law and order issue, created these draconian laws where people could be imprisoned for life without parole for nonviolent offenses, primarily drug offenses. Half of the people today within our prison system, 2.3 million citizens, were never charged with physically harming another person. And of course, most of them are poor people of color who come from the deindustrialized pockets that were created or certainly accelerated by the flight of manufacturing overseas, courtesy of NAFTA. It was Clinton that passed the welfare reform bill, which obliterated our welfare system, and 70% of the original recipients under our old welfare system were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC and has allowed a handful of 5 or 6 corporations to control what 90% of Americans listen to or watch. And it was Clinton who ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks by destroying Glass-Steagall, which precipitated the national and global financial meltdown. After eradicating the populist, progressive movements in this country, and we had a very radical tradition, especially on the eve of World War I, paid for, of course, with the blood of the American working class and African Americans who were intent upon opening up the closed space created by design. Clinton certainly understood that if he did corporate bidding, he would get corporate money. And by the 1990s, the Democratic Party had fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he got more. But at that point, you had a self-identified liberal class that continued to speak in that feel your pain language of liberalism, but betrayed working men and women. And that precipitated the nightmare that faces us now. The Democratic Party is deeply culpable for the arrival of demagogues like Trump. The Democratic Party transformed itself into the Republican Party. I've lived in Europe. The Democratic Party would be a far-right party in France. They transformed themselves into the Republican Party and pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. Now, I come out of a religious tradition. My father was a Presbyterian minister, very involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the gay rights movement, for which the Presbyterian Church pushed him aside. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. And the great failing of the liberal church was, at the inception of this movement, not to call these people out for who they are. You do not need to spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School, as I did, to grasp that Jesus did not come to make us rich. Nothing will protect us until we address the root cause, which is the rupture of the social bonds, the seizure of power by corporate forces, and the deep malaise and alienation and enemy that is rippling across the United States. But the Democratic Party is a creation of the corporate state. There's one party, it's the corporate party. 10 years ago, we suffered a severe financial dislocation. And what was the response of the corporate elite? They created out of electronic ether, according to researchers at the University of Missouri, $26 trillion in fabricated money. Think of what $26 trillion could have done in terms of putting people back to work, making sure that the 8 million families that were evicted from their homes had a place to live, forgiving student debt, creating a rational health system where parents were not forced by corporations to go bankrupt trying to save their sick children. And these speculators, these global speculators, they took this money. They never created jobs. They never buttressed manufacturing. They bought back their own stock, which is what they did with the money they got from the virtual tax boycott. And we now live in a system where by next year, we will be paying over $350 billion on interest, and within 10 years, $900 billion on interest. And they gamble. The fracking industry, aside from destroying the water on which we depend for life, is a money-losing operation. $280 billion. Because the fracking industry, like the dot-com industry, is valued not on the profit it produces, but on projected profit. And this money, this $26 trillion of money, is borrowed at virtually 0% interest from the Fed. In Europe, there were central banks that had negative interest rates, meaning they would pay you to borrow money. But it has to be paid back. And since they're not producing anything of substance, they are imposing harsher and harsher forms of austerity and debt peonage on a beleaguered population that no longer has a voice within the society. What we have done to our students, crippled by monthly payments in the hundreds, if not in the thousands of dollars, unable to find meaningful work. American productivity since 1973 has increased by 77%, and if wages kept pace with productivity, the minimum wage would be over $20 an hour. And yet, over 41 million workers in this country earn less than $12 an hour. That's a third of the workforce, and almost none of them have employee-offered health insurance. That's by design. They are extracting it from us. Even if you have health insurance in this disastrous for-profit system, your co-pays, what's not covered, astronomical pharmaceutical costs are draining you. 1 million bankruptcies a year are caused by people who can't pay medical bills and they had insurance. Dostoevsky wrote that if you want to understand the core of any society, look within its prison system. Look at what it does to its most vulnerable, and you will understand what it intends to do to everyone else. And what's happened in our prisons is that corporations have moved in to profit off of the most vulnerable. It's not just private prisons. It's every aspect of a prison is now privatized. The food service, R-Mart, which there are constant discoveries of food poisoning because of the spoiled, rotten food they are serving to prisoners. Global Tel-Link, which jacks up phone rates so they're 4 to 5 times higher than what you and I pay. And this is especially pernicious, given that for most children who have an incarcerated parent, the phone is their only form of communication. Commissaries are privatized, medical is privatized. It's an industry in the billions of dollars. And their lobbyists are writing the laws to make sure that recidivism rates remain where they are, 76% within 5 years for state prisons. Prisons are a form of social control. You deindustrialized an urban pocket. You force people into the illegal economy. August Wilson says that the great warriors, fighters within the African American community are in prison because when the society did not provide them with a means to care for their family, they went out and cared for their family any way they could. And within those communities, we have instituted reigns of terror. Only 94% of people within our prison system ever get a jury trial. They're stripped of due process, they're stripped of their rights. We've militarized police that kill an average of 3.1 citizens a day, almost all of whom are unarmed. They kick down doors in the middle of the night, wearing Kevlar vests and carrying long-barreled weapons as if it's Iraq for nonviolent warrants. We must look to what's happening to the least among us to understand where the corporate state intends to go. 800,000 to 1 million people within our prison system work for corporations. McDonald's makes its uniforms in prison. And what are they paid? In some states, they're paid nothing. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana is 4 cents an hour. Firefighters in California make $1 an hour. And these corporations see in these prisoners the model worker. They always come to work on time. They don't get paid for sick days or vacation days. They don't have to pay into Social Security. And I have students who have spent decades in prison working 40 hours a week and have no Social Security. They can't organize. They can't complain. And if they're a problem, you put them in solitary confinement, where tonight 80,000 of our citizens are. I'm not the only person in this room to have children, and we are responsible for the world they inherit. And even if we fail, at least let those who come after us say of us, they tried. I don't know if we will succeed. I don't even know if we will survive as a species. But I know these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. And in the end, I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you.